Hello all, and welcome to the afternoon session on day 3 of the 2021 Virginia Highway Safety Summit. I'm going to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Please remain muted for the duration of the session. We want to avoid background noises that could potentially interrupt our speakers. Secondly, please place all questions in the chat box. Our moderator will be monitoring the chat box, and we will conduct a Q&A at the end of the session. Lastly, you have free control of your viewing mode. You can change the viewing mode at the top of your screen. It defaults to View Everyone. We recommend changing that viewing mode to Who's Talking so you are focused on the speaker. As a final quick note, we will be recording the sessions and will be sending out the presentations once the summit is over. With that, I will now turn it over to our moderator this afternoon, Mr. James Entas. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Virginia's Highway Safety Summit session on marijuana usage and its impact on traffic safety. As I think everybody knows, on July 1st of this year, it became legal in Virginia for adults 21 years old and over to possess and use marijuana in Virginia. Not federally, though. How will this new law affect traffic safety? In this session, we'll explore the possible impacts on drug driving crashes, how other states have addressed marijuana legalization, and how Virginia has recently strengthened its drug recognition expert program. I'm going to be serving as your moderator today, and I'll be giving you a brief overview of the changes to Virginia law to get us started. I, as I mentioned, currently serve as Virginia's Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor, providing training and guidance to prosecutors and law enforcement officers in the Commonwealth, with a particular focus on impaired drivers. I served as a prosecutor in Norfolk, Virginia for 20 years, from 94 to 2014, and thereafter for about 5 years with the Virginia Attorney General's Office, and have been Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor starting this year. I am an avid bicyclist, and riding my bikes frequently on the roads of the Commonwealth, I am particularly concerned with deterring impaired drivers and the apprehension and prosecution of those who are undeterred. And it's very important to me to be focused on things that could affect the vulnerability of cyclists, including impairment caused by marijuana. After I give a brief introduction, we'll be joined by Jake Nelson, who is the Director of Traffic Safety Advocacy and Research for AAA's National Office. He serves as the association's Chief Safety Expert and doubles as an epidemiologist and policy advocate, working with state and federal policymakers to apply research and the sciences of public health to public policy development, community-based safety interventions, and consumer education activities. Jake has developed nationwide advocacy strategies, brokered national partnerships, and negotiated strategic alliances to influence consumers, policymakers, and the media. He's been featured in national media outlets from USA Today and the New York Times to appearances on ABC's World News Tonight and the PBS NewsHour. He will be giving us a national overview of marijuana legalization and its impact on traffic safety. Following Jake, we will hear from Glenn Davis, who is the Colorado Department of Transportation's Highway Safety Manager. Glenn is responsible for impaired driving, police services, motorcycle safety, young drivers, and speed enforcement programs in Colorado. And he is the former chair of the Colorado Task Force on Drunk and Impaired Driving, Motorcycle Operator Advisory Board. He was the parliamentarian of the State Traffic Records Advisory Committee and the representative on the Persistent Drunk Driver Committee and Drunk Drivers Alliance. He represented the Colorado Department of Transportation on the Governor's Marijuana Working Group, Marijuana Education Oversight Committee, and Post-Marijuana Working Group. He will be sharing with us lessons that Colorado has learned since Colorado several years ago legalized marijuana, just as Virginia is doing now. Finally, our last station will be from Sergeant Cara Jacobs with the Roanoke County Police Department. Sergeant Jacobs is a drug recognition expert and teaches other officers to become drug recognition experts. She earned a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology from Ferrum College and has worked for the Roanoke County Police since 2011, dedicating her career to impaired driving enforcement. She has worked all 3 patrol shifts and has spent time in the Traffic Enforcement Unit and the Roanoke Valley Regional DUI Task Force. She is a general instructor, field training officer, defensive tactics instructor, and NHTSA standardized field sobriety testing instructor. Sergeant Jacobs is also, as I mentioned, a drug recognition expert and instructor, and has taught several A-RIDE and other DUID courses for officers and prosecutors around the Commonwealth. Now, for an overview of what's happened in Virginia, this all went into effect on July 1st. Some of it is going to take a few years to take effect. But the primary thing that occurred is that marijuana became legal for adults 21 years and older to possess not more than 1 ounce of marijuana for personal use. Again, this applies only to adults aged 21 years and older. It will be allowed to use marijuana in private residences. Nothing, however, prohibits the owner of a private residence from restricting the use of marijuana on his own premises. Adults aged 21 years and over will be allowed to grow up to 4 plants per household. That's not per person, that's per household. Well, there's some restrictions on that. These plants cannot be visible from a public way. The residents must take precautions to prevent access to persons under the age of 21. And there are requirements for the plants to be tagged with the name, identification number, and notation that the plant is being grown for personal use. Adult sharing will also be legalized, which this involves the transfer of 1 ounce or less of marijuana between persons who are, again, 21 years or older, without any exchange of money. Adult sharing does not include instances such as marijuana being given away contemporaneously with another reciprocal transaction. In other words, you cannot get it as a bonus for buying something, or a gift of marijuana is offered or advertised in conjunction with another offer for sale. Again, you cannot give away marijuana in connection with selling another item. And it does not allow a gift of marijuana contingent upon a separate reciprocal transaction for goods or services. It remains illegal for anyone under 21 to consume, purchase, or possess marijuana, or to attempt to consume, purchase, or possess any amount of marijuana. Existing safety measures will remain in place. That includes, in particular of interest for today, it is still prohibited to use marijuana while driving a motor vehicle or while being a passenger in a motor vehicle while it's being driven. It is illegal to possess marijuana on school grounds, while operating a school bus, in a motor vehicle transporting passengers for hire, taxi cabs or Lyft, or in a commercial vehicle. It is illegal to consume marijuana in public. It will remain illegal for anyone to possess more than 1 ounce of marijuana. The penalties have changed substantially, but it is still illegal to possess more than 1 ounce of marijuana. Individuals found guilty of possessing more than 1 ounce, but not more than 1 pound, will be subject to a civil penalty of a fine of $25. Individuals convicted of possessing more than 1 pound are guilty of a felony. It will remain illegal to distribute or sell marijuana and or to possess any amount of marijuana with the intent to distribute or sell it. This prohibition applies equally to businesses, which will not be permitted to sell, gift, or in any other way distribute marijuana. Virginia has created an authority called the Virginia Cannabis Control Authority as the overseeing regulatory agency. There are many provisions that won't go into effect this year and will be phased in over the next several years. Again, it remains illegal to drive while impaired by any substance. That has always been the case with alcohol. It has always been the case with marijuana, and this changes none of that. What may change, however, is marijuana becoming illegal. We may have many people, law-abiding citizens, who now decide to try it and don't realize that they're impaired. Marijuana has impairing properties, and you'll hear some of that from Sergeant Jacobs during our final session. And with that, I'll turn things over to Jake Nelson from AAA. Welcome, Jake.
Thanks, Jimmy. I appreciate it. Let's see if I can pull my slides up here. And if I can get a thumbs up from you, if you can see my slides, I'll go ahead and get started.
Yep, you're good.
All right, thanks. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be talking a little bit about driving high and asleep at the wheel. And by asleep at the wheel, I'm referring to being so confused by misinformation about cannabis use and driving that you might as well be asleep at the wheel. There is a lot. How do I advance these slides?
You can use your arrow button
I can.
or down on the bottom left. You should see, there you go. Yep.
There we go. Now I see it. All right. So there's a lot of misinformation out there about cannabis use and driving. And this includes everything from how dangerous it is, how long it stays in your system, and how likely we are as drivers who may choose to use shortly before getting behind the wheel, how likely we are to get caught by police. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But first, I just wanted to make a comment about alcohol. And so for obvious reasons, we're talking all about cannabis today. And I would say generally, as somebody who speaks around the country on this topic, on impaired driving generally, cannabis gets a majority of the attention. And I always try to just stop and acknowledge that alcohol impairment is still a huge factor in fatal crashes in this country. Obviously, it's something that we've been working on and chipping away at as a nation for many decades. And while we've made great strides on reducing alcohol impaired driving and the crashes, injuries, and deaths that result from that dangerous behavior, we still have a lot more work to do. And so we're talking about cannabis today because it was recently legalized in Virginia, as you know, and we want to talk a little bit about sort of correcting some of that misinformation that's out there, sort of looking at the lay of the land, the state of the states as it relates to cannabis legalization, and then talk a little bit about some of the ways that we can be good proctors of information as it relates to cannabis and driving. And then now that it's legal in Virginia, what are some options, some opportunities available to us to keep safety front and center in this new environment? So let's get after it. So we're going to talk a little bit about what people think. So on this slide, which shows data from the Pew Research Center, it's through 2017, but the curve, if we had more recent data, would look very, very similar. The trends would stay the same. Big takeaways from this slide is that more and more people are supporting the legalization of marijuana over time, and less support for keeping it illegal. And that support for the liberalization of cannabis is highest among the youngest generations, and support is lowest among the older generations. One of the things that organizations who conduct polls and surveys like this one often fail to do is they rarely attempt to tease out legalization of cannabis for recreational purposes is compared to making the drug legal to use recreationally and decriminalizing the use of that drug. And so some of the organizations that have attempted to do that, what they find are curves that look very similar to what's on the screen now, although the support for legalization is lower. And so that support is still going up, and it's still highest among youngest generations, but it's not as high as you would see, or as the data on the screen would suggest. A lot of younger generations are focused squarely on sort of the criminal aspects of possessing small amounts of cannabis and the implications on racial and ethnic minority populations, and rightfully so. So if we tease those two issues apart, support for legalizing the drug for fun, as I often say, is not as high as these data would suggest, but general support has gone up over time, especially among younger populations. So the AAA Foundation every year does a national survey of motorists 16 years of age and older on a whole range of highway safety issues, cannabis legalization and cannabis impaired driving included. And so here are just a couple data points from our most recent survey of motorists. We see that about 70% of motorists that we surveyed would describe driving within an hour of using cannabis as very or extremely dangerous, and you compare that to 94% for alcohol and 88% for prescription or over-the-counter medications. This is alarming, and I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, and you would all agree with that sentiment. But again, there's a lot of misinformation out there in the media and put out by other advocacy organizations about how dangerous or not using cannabis and then getting behind the wheel of a car truly is. Over 70% of people do not believe that people who are driving after using will get caught by police. And that is something that we can easily change. And you'll hear about the drug recognition expert program momentarily. But law enforcement do have tools to identify. There are signs and symptoms of someone being impaired by cannabis. You can pick out an impaired driver, not necessarily by cannabis, but an impaired driver regardless of what substance or substances would contribute to that observed impairment. And then as you'll hear from a speaker momentarily about the DRE program, there are many ways you can identify and narrow down what class or classes of drug, cannabis included, might be an explanation for that observed impairment. So we can identify and catch cannabis impaired drivers, and we need to dispel that myth that's out there so that we can deter the behavior in the first place. Good news is majority of people disapprove of drivers using cannabis and then getting behind the wheel of a car within an hour. So if you were to look at all the published literature on looking for the association between the use of cannabis and crash risk, you'll find studies that say that it makes you safer. You'll find studies that say that there is no effect whatsoever. And you'll find studies that say that you're 17 times more likely to cause a crash if you use cannabis and get behind the wheel. All of these studies, which is true of any study, no matter how good and rigorous it is, have strengths and limitations. But if we look at the weight of all of that evidence, taking into consideration the strengths and limitations of the methods used to conduct those studies, we generally see that cannabis use increases a driver's risk of causing a traffic crash by between 30 and 200%. So as a rule of thumb, I typically say that cannabis, recent use of cannabis roughly doubles your risk of causing a traffic crash. There are going to be other people like myself who speak on this topic that might disagree with me. They might quote a higher or a lower risk estimate. But looking at the entire weight of the evidence, this is where I, as an epidemiologist, feel most comfortable educating consumers about the risk of using and driving. So what are the ways that cannabis can impair our ability to drive safely? You can probably all guess them. In fact, you probably already know, given what you do for your jobs. It impairs judgment, motor coordination, and reaction time. It's true that there is some evidence out there that suggests that people who drive after using cannabis make compensatory adjustments to the way that they drive to compensate for the fact that they could be impaired. But these studies are not consistent across and within populations. And so the takeaway is that while there are some people who might drive more slowly if they've used marijuana before they get behind the wheel of a car, they may not always drive more slowly, and the person next to them may not make that same decision. So it is not a population level finding in the data. And one point worth emphasizing to anyone that you're talking to about the potential risks of using and driving is that even if it's not your fault, even if you're not the reason for the traffic crash, using and driving makes you less able to respond to somebody else causing a traffic crash. It makes it less likely that you can use evasive maneuvers to get out of the way of a crash that you might otherwise avoid. So don't use and drive. I know that you all know that, but just some of the evidence that's out there on this topic. The AAA Foundation has done some other research relative to cannabis use and driving. One was to understand what the crash data tell us about, the fatal crash data tell us about how recent cannabis use shows up in those data. Another study worked to identify if there was a per se standard that would allow us, within reason, to predict impairment among users of cannabis who were involved in traffic crashes. And so I'm going to talk about each of those studies here momentarily. Some of you have probably seen this graphic before. So we've done actually 2 studies looking at data from Washington State, one of the first 2 states to liberalize cannabis for recreational purposes. So the first study that we did looked at about 5 years of data, 2 before the law took effect and 3 years after. And we found that the proportion of drivers who had recently used cannabis, meaning that they had active THC in their blood, more than doubled from 8 to 17% pre to post law taking effect. A couple years later, we repeated this study looking at 10 years of data. One of the big criticisms that we got of the first study was that, oh, what you're measuring is just a temporary artifact of the law having taken effect, and over time, that proportion will level out to what it was before the law took effect, or it will decrease in some way. And when we did that, what we found was that the association didn't really change. So that the proportion of fatal crash involved drivers essentially remained doubled, even with 10 years of data and multiple years after the law had taken effect. One point worth emphasizing here is in this study, we controlled for the fact that now that recreational marijuana was legal in Washington, that obviously there would be more testing of drivers involved in crashes. We controlled for the fact that testing rates increased. So our data are not a function of the fact that we're looking for more people who have cannabis in their system, and therefore we're going to find more in the data. We controlled for that. Another thing worth pointing out here is that what these data tell us is that recent use of cannabis is a growing contributing factor to fatal crashes. It is not telling us that the number of fatal traffic crashes doubled after the law took effect. 2 very different scenarios, both equally as important. The other study, as I said, sought to look for a meaningful and reliable per se standard, similar to what we have for alcohol, 0.08 laws, that we could use for delta 9 THC or active THC, the psychoactive element of cannabis. And while I think 6 or more states have established various standards to try to accomplish that goal, none of them are really based on any meaningful data. In this study, we looked at data from 10 different states that had DRE programs where fatal crashes had occurred, where drivers were arrested for impaired driving and were found to have cannabis in their system, and looked for any relationship between likelihood of being arrested, likelihood of being in a crash, and use of cannabis at various levels. And the punchline of the study was that there was no per se standard. There was no concentration of active THC that allowed us to reliably predict impairment among users of cannabis who were involved in these crashes. Not at high levels, not at low levels. There was no population level concentration that allowed us to make that kind of reliable prediction. And so when states legalize marijuana or cannabis for recreational or medicinal purposes, and they set a per se standard for active THC, these are policy decisions. They are not decisions that are based on science and data that are meaningful in any way. So one of the things that folks who work in our field often point to is oral fluid screening and testing. So a couple things to clarify here. Oral fluid screening is not the same thing as oral fluid testing in a laboratory. So taking an oral fluid specimen from a driver at roadside suspected of impaired driving and getting a result within 10 minutes is a screening result. Screening results are notoriously not always that accurate. That's why we don't make diagnoses of cancer based on a screening test. It just warrants a deeper dive, additional testing to make that diagnosis. And the same is true in this context. If you have a screening result that indicates presence of one or more drugs, cannabis being one of those options, it warrants a more rigorous, reliable examination of either the specimen that you already took or a second specimen of oral fluid or a specimen of blood. And one of the assumptions that a lot of people who do what we all do for work is that the use of oral fluid screening at the roadside is essentially the breathalyzer for drugs other than alcohol, and will allow us to treat drug impaired drivers the way that we treat alcohol impaired drivers in terms of how we predict whether or not they're impaired, how impaired they are, and how do we adjudicate those DUI suspects afterwards. Oral fluid screening at the roadside and confirmatory testing in the laboratory is a really useful tool. It provides additional evidence in these cases. It allows us to get a sample more proximate to the time that somebody was driving versus 2 to 2.5 hours later, which is the average time it takes to get a warrant for a blood sample. And we'll talk about why that's important for this particular drug in a moment. And it also can be a tool, roadside oral fluid screening in particular, can be a tool to make better educated, informed decisions about whether or not you should call a DRE to assist on a case, and whether or not it can provide probable cause to get a search warrant for a blood sample if that's what the law states you have to do in your state. So it can help build probable cause, help make decisions about getting confirmation testing to confirm that the results you got in your roadside screen are accurate, those results from the lab being admissible in court in that case if it were to go to court. So there is value in oral fluid screening and testing, but it won't allow us to treat drug impaired drivers the way that we do alcohol impaired drivers using breathalyzers and all the tools and resources that we're familiar with. So if we can't have per se standards, at least meaningful ones, then what should we do? What AAA recommends is that the real evidence of impaired driving is what gets you pulled over in the first place and your performance on standard field sobriety tests. Ideally, you could add to that the opinion of a drug recognition expert. And I said you'll hear more about that program momentarily. And then if you have a positive chemical test for active THC, not the inactive metabolites, but the psychoactive element of the drug, what causes impairment, at any concentration at all, just proof of recent use, plus the other evidence of impaired driving, that would give way to permissible inference, a jury instruction from a judge to a jury where they can make an administrative decision that that person was impaired behind the wheel when they're operating that motor vehicle. It's an optional path for jurors, but we think that that is a reasonable alternative to a per se standard for cannabis, which could allow some people who are wildly impaired walk and have other people who are not at all impaired actually get convicted of a crime that there was no evidence to prove that they committed. So this is what we recommend at AAA. This is a map just showing the state of the states right now as it relates to legalization of recreational and medicinal cannabis. So we have 18 states plus DC where recreational use cannabis is now legal. New Mexico, Virginia, obviously, and Connecticut being the most recent to join the club. And in 37 state, medicinal cannabis is legal to use. Wherever you see a red pin in this map is where there is a per se standard for active THC. And those standards in these states range from 1 nanogram per milliliter all the way up to 5. None of them are based on actual science or data that are meaningful in terms of allowing us to predict with accuracy and reliability that that person was actually impaired because the blood concentration of active THC at the time the sample was drawn was whatever level they found. But these are policy decisions that lawmakers have made. So the next part of my presentation is I'm going to run through it pretty quickly, but they're just good tips for you to keep in mind as safety advocates and the work that you do every day interacting with the people that you interact with. This is basically just some guidance for all of us to be better stewards of data and research and helping to dismiss false information or misinformation that we encounter day to day in our line of work. So the first here is vocabulary misuse. And so you'll hear a lot of people talk about cannabis, marijuana, THC, active THC, carboxy THC. The point here is that when you hear people talk about how cannabis can be in your body for weeks, sometimes even months after you used it, that is true, but it's for the inactive metabolites of cannabis. It's for the parts of the drug that have been broken down and are no longer causing impairment. And so if what you care about as maybe an employer is recent use of a federally controlled scheduled substance, then sure, that's useful information. If you're trying to use that kind of data to prove impairment, driver impairment, not useful. So when we are talking about driver impairment as it relates to cannabis, we should be very careful to use active THC, delta-9 THC, or just to say the psychoactive part of cannabis or marijuana, to be very clear that that's what we're talking about. And you should ask for clarification on that point too when you hear people speak on this topic or you hear people try to educate others on the topic. The next item here is the dearth of the research. And so this just basically refers to the fact that when we set the first laws relative to alcohol impaired driving mitigation in the United States, we had about 30 years of research to help inform that decision making. And we have nowhere near that amount of research that's meaningful, good research on cannabis use and driving to make those same quality policy decisions relative to this drug as it relates to driver safety. And so in many ways, we're really painting the plane as we fly it, legalizing a drug for people to have fun recreationally without really having a good handle and system in place for managing the potential highway safety implications of that policy decision. The next here is the internal validity of the early studies. And so while it's true that there isn't as much research on cannabis and driving as there is on alcohol impaired driving, even among the research that is available to us, the earliest of those studies had a fundamental internal validity issue involved. And that was essentially that at that time, the best and brightest, it just wasn't known. Those researchers did not know that it was delta-9 THC that was active THC and that was psychoactive as compared to the inactive metabolites of cannabis. And so in the earliest of days studying the relationship of use of cannabis and driver safety and crash risk, researchers tried to find a correlation between the inactive metabolites of the drug and crash risk and driver safety indicators. And of course, they didn't find a relationship because those metabolites of the drug don't cause driver impairment. And so if somebody is putting a fact sheet out or providing education to consumers about how safe or unsafe use of this drug and driving is, and they're including some of that earlier work, either intentionally or most likely unintentionally, not knowing that there were fundamental flaws in that work, the overall weight of the evidence is going to suggest a lower level of risk or a lower impact in terms of the way that cannabis can affect skills important for safe driving performance. And so we have to be sort of careful to look for that and to ask questions about that in the work that we do. This one, federal versus street marijuana, is just referring to the fact that the cannabis that is sold legally through dispensaries in states where it's legal to do so today doesn't have, has active THC content. Let's just talk about the plant, the smoked marijuana. Active THC or delta-9 THC concentrations hovering around 30%. Obviously, it's much higher, even approaching 100% for oils and waxes. But for the plant form of the drug, hovers around 30%. And what grandpa and grandma, if they were users in the 60s and 70s, used had an active THC concentration of between 3 and 5%. The federal government actually runs a farm in the South that grows marijuana for the purposes of medical research. And that strain of marijuana has an active THC concentration of between 10 and 13%. Some argue some of the best and brightest in the field who research this all the time argue that regardless of the fact that federal marijuana for use in research has a lower active THC concentration, the psychoactive part of the drug, that users of marijuana will titrate until they reach the level of impairment or the high that they want, regardless. And there are others in the research community who disagree with that and would argue that even the research that we have available to us using this federal strain of marijuana for research purposes isn't really telling us a lot about the effect of the product as it's available every day in states legally through dispensaries where it's legal to do so. Next is DUI arrest and conviction data, and this really just speaks to the incentive structure that exists for law enforcement in states where there aren't graduated sanctions or separate charges for DUI alcohol, DUI drug, or DUI polysubstance. And so if you have a driver that you've stopped for, being a suspected impaired driver, and you can confirm a BAC of 0.08 or higher, and that's the per se standard in your state, then there's really no reason for you to spend the extra time and the extra money to continue to investigate the presence of other potentially impairing drugs. That doesn't mean that some officers don't still do that. That certainly happens, especially among drug recognition experts, but it doesn't always happen. And if the suspect isn't going to pay another $1 in fines, spend one more day in jail potentially, or face any additional sanctions or penalties whatsoever, if you can prove the other drug or drugs beyond alcohol, then what's the point of the additional time and money in the investigation to find and confirm those other drugs? So this is a real problem in the data that we have to understand the magnitude and scope of drug driving in the United States, both for cannabis and for every other drug out there that is potentially impairing as well, prescribed over-the-counter drugs and other illicit substances. Drug testing for drivers in fatal crashes happens in about 2% of fatal crashes in some states, and in others, over 90%. These are the data that are rolled up nationally into the FARS database managed by NHTSA that we use to estimate the magnitude and scope of drugged driving as a factor in fatal crashes. So if in the states that only collect those data in 2% of fatal crashes were to suddenly next week start collecting it in 90% of fatal crashes, it's very likely that the national picture that is painted, and especially the picture that is painted for that particular state, is going to look wildly different. But these are the best data that we have. So in FARS today, about half of all the fatal crashes in that database even have results from drug testing those drivers involved in those crashes. And among the half that for whom we have results, then we can make estimates about which drugs were showing up and what the magnitude and scope using those data are. But as you can see, since we only have that information for half of the data in the database, you have to be really careful with making policy decisions, especially using those data as justification. And then the last thing here is really just speaking to peak THC, blood, and fatty tissue concentrations. And so this is a super crude picture to illustrate a very simple but important point. And so if you look at the solid line here and know that that refers to the concentration of active THC in blood, and the dotted line or dashed line refers to the concentration of active THC in the fatty tissues of our brain, most people presume that peak impairment occurs here, when actually it occurs here. And so if you were to make an arrest or a traffic stop and ultimately arrest somebody for suspicion of impaired driving, and you suspect that cannabis is to blame, where the lower arrow is here pointing at the dashed line, and it takes 2 to 2.5 hours before you can get a warrant for a blood draw. And so now you're over here sometime when you finally can collect the blood sample. And this is the level of active THC you're going to find in blood, even though the impairment occurs in the brain. And so as we continue to do the work that we do and we collect, we want to collect oral fluid, or we want to collect blood and look for the concentration of active THC in either of those specimens to make a decision about how impaired somebody is, you can see the fundamental flaw in that approach. The only way we would really get an accurate estimate is if we were to take a brain fatty tissue sample, and obviously that's not happening. So again, use of oral fluid to detect drug drivers can be a really useful tool, but it doesn't help solve the problem for us, and it certainly doesn't allow us to treat alcohol or drug impaired driving like we can alcohol impaired driving. So I'm just wrapping up here. This is a report that's free and available to anyone on the AAA Foundation's website. It has a variety of recommendations for the state and federal level to improve data quality and availability related to drug driving. So check that out if that is a goal within your state. And then this is a list of recommendations. I'm not going through all of them with you, but you'll have access to this after the presentation today. But some that I would highlight for you. So cannabis is legal, now what? How can we make sure that we keep safety front and center? You want to avoid bad public policy. So don't establish a per se standard that's meaningless for drugs other than alcohol. Maybe one day we'll get there. We're not there yet, so avoid that. Number two, I'd highlight, look at having separate charges, not necessarily graduated sanctions, but at a minimum, separate charges for DUI alcohol, DUI drugs, and DUI polysubstance. That way, the data that we have is better, and we can make better informed policy decisions about this topic moving forward in Virginia. Three, I'd say partner with the dispensaries within the state. They don't want their customers to be unsafe either, but they also don't have the resources or the expertise, nor should we expect them to provide accurate and meaningful education about the legal ramifications of driving while high or the potential safety implications of doing so. And so as highway safety advocates, we can work with dispensaries to arm them with information to provide customers and to keep the public safe. And then lastly, leverage oral fluid to get drug tox results that are more proximate to the time that somebody was driving, and push for electronic warrant systems if those aren't already available in the state. And even if they are legal in the state to have, not all courts do it. So work to make that happen because it helps to get specimen more proximate to the time that somebody was driving, even if you're not using oral fluid, even for blood. So those would be my recommendations, and I'll close here.
Thank you very much, Jake. And before I turn it over to Glenn, just a couple of housekeeping things. We do have a chat for questions. We are encouraging everyone attending today, if you have any questions, enter them into the chat. We are going to, once Cara is finished with our third segment, ask the panelists each of the questions. It's going to be the last segment is to answer the questions from the chat. We've only had a couple so far. And then regarding the presentations, Jake just made a little reference to his presentation. They will be sent out once the summit is entirely complete. There's one more day of the summit. There's one final session tomorrow morning regarding the evolution of the 4 E's at 9:30 in the morning. And with that, I'll turn it over to Glenn Davis from Colorado to give us a perspective on Colorado's experience legalizing marijuana. Thank you, Glenn. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, can my screen be seen?
Yes, you're good.
You're good.
Okay. Well, thank you, Virginia. I'm happy to be here. I've done quite a few of these. I'm not the expert on everything, certainly, but I am on the expert of being first. And I'm going to tell you about legalized recreational cannabis and its effect on traffic safety. And I'm just going to tell it from Colorado's point of view. How do I advance here?
You go down to the left where you just were, you'll see the little arrows. Go down to the left of the presentation. There you go.
Did that advance it though?
Yes, the arrows will pop up and you can move forward. Or you could just try using your arrows on your keyboard.
Let's try that.
There you go.
Did that advance?
Yep.
Okay. I think y'all saw my bio. I tried to find a picture of me that was less grumpy, but I couldn't. Let me tell you, our language is important. And we're in our 6th year of sales, and we're in our 22nd year of legalization. We actually legalized cannabis in 1999, and we're in our 6th year of sales. But if I say we, that's the Colorado Highway Safety Office, and that's the view and the position of our office. We call marijuana cannabis unless it's specifically identified in statute as marijuana. It's cannabis. That's how the industry wants it. That is how most of our customers talk about it. We call medical marijuana cannabis and recreational marijuana cannabis because it's cannabis. It's all the same thing. It's grown the same place. It doesn't know it's recreational medical. It's cannabis. A marijuana user is a cannabis consumer. People that consume cannabis in Colorado are taking cannabis, and traffic accidents are traffic crashes. We don't have problems in Colorado. We have challenges, and we take them all on. And we also have opportunities, and opportunity is an issue that needs to be resolved. If I mention law enforcement, that's any police, state trooper, deputy, any type of peace officer in the state. Delta-9 THC is the main psychoactive substance found in cannabis that my state has identified to be the psychoactive ingredient, though there are others. Cannabinoid is any compound found in cannabis, and a nanogram is a billionth of a gram. So like that sweet and low package, that's a gram there. So if you could imagine 1/billionth of that, 5 billionths of that would be enough in a person's body in the whole blood to show impairment. Now, again, I told you this is a Colorado story. I'm going to just tell you from our point of view, I'm not apologizing for it. I am not an advocate for legalized recreational cannabis, though at the end of this, a lot of people think I am. I am an advocate for good government. In Colorado, it's not law, it is a constitutional amendment. It's Constitutional Amendment number 64. And any adult in Colorado, 21 years old or older, has a constitutional right to have, possess, and use recreational cannabis. It's about good government. This is what the people of the state voted for, and it actually passed at a higher rate than the Amendment 20, which was the medical. This is what they're going to get. I'm very candid because I don't think I'll see most of y'all again, and I don't want anybody to think I'm not sure what that guy said. I want you to know exactly what our state's position is. I'm a realist. This is real. This is on. We're in our 6th year. It's not going anywhere. I think your state is in a real good position for legalization because you have not started sales yet. When sales start, that's when everything starts to change. And the reason that there's so many states using it and it's so popular right now is people like weed. People have been driving high before cannabis was legalized. People have been driving high when there were stagecoaches. People drive high. But we're going to have a different challenge in traffic safety now because we have greater availability, a change in culture, and a higher content quality. Jacob gave some of the best practices, and I appreciate that. In Colorado, they're similar. We call them the 10 lessons, and we call them the 10 lessons because they're kind of catchy. But when looking back, there was 10 things I think we really learned that we would like to impart to other states or other parts of the world that are doing this. Beware of the tipping point, and I ask my own questions in here. Why? Because when the tipping point happens, it's time to start mobilizing and mobilization. If a state feels that won't happen here, I think they're going to get lost, they're going to get behind. Our time that we saw the tipping point was we had Amendment 20 for medical in 1999, and it was managed so well by the cannabis industry and the Marijuana Enforcement Division that it really put the cannabis industry in a position to go, we need to go recreational. It was really smart of them because they put us in a position that if it was managed poorly, it wouldn't work, but we're the ones that had to manage it. And for Virginia, I just did a quick search before I got on here. Marijuana is now legal in Virginia. Advocates are pushing for changes to the law. So in my opinion, your tipping point's arrived. From a policy standpoint, I think it's important to position your agency for funding. Prior to cannabis legalization, my DRE program my budget was $50,000. 2015, it was $500,000. My budget increased tenfold. And I was happy to take it, and we really did some good things to the DRE program. Our impaired driving awareness for cannabis, we used whatever we could scrape out of NHTSA $405 percentage in 2015, and since it's been $950,000. That's more than my alcohol awareness. So there is money that it's going to generate when sales start. And I put a link down there, and when you get these, get my slides, you can look at all these links, and it takes you a lot of information. But that's to a House bill that just passed, House Bill 211317, and that was to legislate the concentrates. But there's a rider in the very back of the bill that gives $2 million to my office for impaired driving funding. And that's all because it was tied to cannabis and it was supported by the cannabis industry. There is a bunch of money available when sales start. And the reason I'm asking you to position your office is because other agencies are positioning their offices too. When cannabis was legalized, Human Services had a budget. Public Safety had a budget, but the general traffic safety, we got a little bit behind. In Colorado, cannabis sales are taxed at 2.9 medical and 15% recreational. And it generates about $1 million a day in taxes. And every quarter since sales started, the amount increases. All I want like 3 days worth of that, but you have to get in there and you have to sometimes fight for it. But I would ask you to take a look at your agency and say, if cannabis is legalized, what would the effects be in a year, 5 years, and how much budget will we need? I would ask you also to find or designate the expert for impaired driving marijuana, and it's for consistency, basically. If you don't have an expert, there's somebody may self-proclaim, and I think it's healthier if it comes out of a highway safety office, a state patrol, or a police agency. And the expert in impaired driving cannabis is somebody I'm talking to that's in this conference right now. Another lesson we learn is to advocate for traffic safety and don't get it lost. Traffic safety, when cannabis starts to get legalized, will not be hot. What will be hot is how many feet can it be from a school? Can it look like a cartoon character? What are the hours? Can medical have a separate entrance? Because the public and the legislation in my state felt that, well, law enforcement, they're already on top of all this. They got all this down. You know, it's really not a change. It's something they're going to be doing. The focus is on social issues. And when task forces are created, and that's what every state that has legalized has done, and had a task force created, it's often short of traffic safety advocates. That link is to our Amendment 64, which you can look at, and there's only one traffic safety recommendation in there, and it's for A-RIDE. And it even recommended A-RIDE be put in academies. Well, A-RIDE is advanced roadside impaired driving enforcement. It's not academy appropriate, but the main thing is mentioned there, so that's a hook to get probably some funding for it. But traffic safety will get lost if there are not advocates in there. This is probably the biggest one we learned, to seek your partnerships early and often. And you're going to be working with new non-traditional partners. Those two pictures I have there, the one on the top, that was a DRE graduation we did, and we did it on April 19th, 2015, the day before 420, and it was State Patrol specific. We had so much media we couldn't all park them all. We had Al Jazeera was there. It was a great hook for media, and that lady next to me was part of the marijuana industry group, and then the lady on the photo with me down, she was the past chair. The marijuana industry group in my state is very, very powerful, and they can get us into places we can't get into. And I'd like to kind of give you an oversight of our group, and feel free to compare and contrast some of their qualities with some other people you work with. Like, I'm just going to use motorcycle safety advocates of mine, like Colorado Abate and things like that. I'm going to describe the cannabis group because the motorcycle group sometimes is a little bit different, but the cannabis industry in my state are young, and there's nothing wrong with not being young, but they're very young. They're highly educated. They are politically savvy. And by that I mean, and this should go without saying, but legislatively, they dress appropriately. They don't show up in their leathers. They're on time. They raise their hands. They have a nameplate with their name. It's not Spider, Zodiac, or anything that you can't read into a record. They listen and they read. by reading, if you give them something to read, they will read every single word of it and have comments on it, and that's fine. They also have an agenda, and they'll probably even share their agenda with you. The biggest thing I found, but I knew this, they are very, very well funded. They have access to a lot of money, and they're not opposed to sharing it if it's for something that they think benefits their mission as long as yours. We're hosting the Governor's Highway Safety Conference this year in Colorado, and one of our sponsors is the marijuana industry because they're going to give us money to buy some of our shirts. They use the word "we" a lot. What can we do? How can we help? What can we do to, etc. And the important one, cannabis is not a hobby to them. It's a religion. You're not going to talk them out of it. You're not going to tell them it's bad. They believe in it. It's a religion to them. Partnerships and hope you can still hear me. Partnerships and stakeholders. These are just some of the stakeholders that we've worked with, and from LIFT to the marijuana group to State Patrol to CSU to No DUI Colorado. That link down there will go to our Colorado DUI cannabis conversation. We were not really what we felt in touch with our industry or our consuming public, so we interviewed about 10,000 people to see. And some of the things that we saw, some of the things that Jacob talked about, people think they drive better, they don't think it's that bad, but we needed to really take a look at that to see. The biggest place that cannabis consumers get information is at point of sale or point of use. And I agree, it is not really up to the bud tenders to be our advocates, but they should be educated. And we do educate them about what cannabis does, to encourage people not to drive high. But those people are the ones that can get the message across. Those don't be high, and I'll be blunt, don't drive high. Those are two of the masks that we had this year during COVID. Partnerships too. We have a state DUI task force. It's mandated by statute. Any putting on there has to be approved by the state legislature. I was the chair at the time, and we have two groups from the cannabis industry. We have the marijuana industry group, and we have somebody who represents the industry, the actual supply chain. The political capital that we got by putting the cannabis industry on that group is huge. And they're great partners. And granted, they represent their advocacy, but putting them on there really solidified us with them. I stay in my lane, and I recommend you do too. And it's focusing on what you can change and what you can't. We try to keep our message consistent, and we try and keep the focus on the issue. When I was on the Amendment 64 panels, and we're talking about, can it look like a gummy bear, or can it look like this, or this is actually a Keith Cola root beer, it's got to be sealed a certain way. That's not my field. My focus is impairment. If people get a hold of it, they're going to be impaired. And when people get out of their lane, we found they got weak. Look for opportunities to educate, and it really helps the credibility. An example, and I think Cara's going to talk about this in a moment, we really used it to promote our DRE program. The DRE program is very well known in Colorado as far as law enforcement is concerned and other entities, but it wasn't known in the state legislature. It is now, and a lot of people in the legislature read about it and thought, well, that's the solution to everything. We'll just make everybody a DRE. You have to educate, you can't make every officer a DRE. It's not for everybody. Here's what we need. Here's how much we need. It's a real good opportunity to get people talking traffic safety. Keep the focus on impairment is our 8th lesson that we learned. Impairment is impairment. It's not about an anagram. It's not about a device. Those are fine. We cannot use devices like that in Colorado. But to me, it's about old-time police work. It's about law enforcement's ability to identify and document the indicia of impairment. And a lot of that's done through, Cara will probably talk more through the standard field sobriety testing, but I've arrested plenty of DUIs back in the day that didn't give me a test. I didn't have a device because I could articulate the impairment. Number 9, it's important to know your partner's positions, whether it be the marijuana industry, cannabis industry, the state, NHTSA, or the governor's office. And this helps with navigation. It avoids unnecessary communications and meetings, so we are very tight with our state offices. The governor keeps everybody informed where everybody is, and we meet frequently, and it helps set your mission. When we first started doing this, we couldn't use cannabis money because it hadn't been collected yet. It takes about a year to get it collected, so we were using our federal money, and our NHTSA region was kind of reluctant about some of the edginess of our ads. I understand that, but we had a different audience and we had to do something different. So now that we've taken NHTSA out, we know what we could and couldn't do. We do it solely with state money. But we have frequent meetings. There's a marijuana education oversight committee. There's frequent meetings so everybody knows what everybody's position is, and that's very helpful. And you can use this environment for opportunities. These two links will take you back to a couple House bills that are still current today. Hard data was substandard in a lot of ways. It's still challenging for access, but we didn't have a lot of DUI data. We didn't have a lot of impaired driving data. And I was not a visionary, but I was saying that for like 10 years. And when cannabis was legalized, everybody wants data, and they want it quick and they want it now, and it's not available. And I said somebody big is going to get embarrassed if we don't have it. And other people said that too. Washington's data, for example, was fantastic. So using Washington's data as a model, House Bill 1713-15 was passed. That will take you to its report. A report is done every year, and it documents reports on every DUI in the state, from how much was in their system, was it blood, was it alcohol, was it refused. We never had anything like that. And if we didn't legalize cannabis, I don't think we would have had it because traffic safety just wasn't that high. Senate Bill 13283 does an annual report. I put 2 asterisks on there because it just came out yesterday. And I'll give you the highlights of that, but that is a report of marijuana use in the state every year. And that started way even before sales. That is very handy. And the money that pays for these 2 bills comes from the marijuana cash tax fund. It's an opportunity to promote DRE and A-RIDE. I talk a little bit about that, but if people don't know what that is, the law enforcement, you can tell them. It's an opportunity to grow. When we do a DRE school, we dose people with alcohol and put them through the roadside so we can see their manifestation. I don't know why we don't dose them with cannabis, because it's a perfectly legal substance in our state. I think we should do that. The United States Attorney has a different view, but I do think there's going to come a point where you're going to start seeing some of that stuff. Roadside evaluations we've done, and if there is an opportunity to get diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that's important too, because that's where things are going. There's a link to the cannabis conversation. There's a link to my office's drug data. We have done some work with the Latino and Hispanic communities. That's very important that we keep them engaged and involved. We've had some mural artists. We don't want to do any targeting. We want to make them subtle, positive, and disarming. And we've also worked with our Latino community.
Para mantenerse seguro es bueno tener un plan y no arriesgar la seguridad de los demás. Es importante que juntos sigamos dirigiendo un buen paso para Colorado. Colorado is the gold standard for the marijuana industry, and we want people to know that it's just not okay to drive high. You put yourself at risk and you put others at risk. If you drive high, you will get a DUI. Driving high around the United States and frankly around the globe is not a new thing. However, this year for 420 as the trend. When we came out of the cannabis conversation, which we used our marijuana user funds, we want to really get to partner with the cannabis consuming public, and let's find solutions to driving high. We know a lot about alcohol. We don't know a lot about cannabis.
That was a voiceover, apparently, something I did in the past, but this is just some data from Colorado that we work with. We arrest about 27,000 people a year for DUI, and out of that, there's about 16,000 tests because people can refuse tests in Colorado. And we get about 15,000 were alcohol, 5,000 were screened for cannabis, and 3,000 were for other drugs of abuse. So all this data we're getting is only about based on 1/5 of all our arrests. This came out of that Senate Bill 13283, which I said it's kind of wordy, so I'm just going to hit the highlights that came out of it in red. Our DRE program increased from 129 in legalization, since legalization in 221. That's a 36% emphasis or increase, and it's on areas of underserved. There's CSP is our best data source. Colorado State Patrol does about 40% of all the DUIs in the state, and they show an increase in cannabis DUIs, DUIs with cannabis only, and cannabis with other substance. And then traffic fatalities with a driver cannabinoid present are up 140%. Now that doesn't show impairment basically, but it shows evidence of use. So we do know that the public is consuming a lot more. My closing arguments for years, Colorado, like many states, has struggled with impaired driving alcohol. In the 80s, groups like MAD, NHTSA, and ICP led the charges with advocacy for victims, better legislation, standard field sobriety testing. When I started in 79, there was no road sites. It's crazy. The drug recognition expert training, preliminary breath testing, and our office feels we have a responsibility to lead, an opportunity to learn, and begin to create a culture with cannabis consumers of responsible use, unlike the alcohol culture in the 80s. So we don't have to do the same thing we did before. There's my contact information, and if anybody needs anything, please let me know, and I'll get this PowerPoint to everybody soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Glenn. That was fantastic. Again, for everybody in the audience, we do have a chat feature. That's that little bubble up near the right top. If you'd like to ask questions of any of our panelists, please enter them in the chat, and we're going to get to all of your questions at the end of Cara's segment. With that, I'll turn things over to Sergeant Cara Jacobs from the Roanoke County Police Department for a perspective on how Virginia has prepared for marijuana legalization via the Drug Recognition Expert Program, and how law enforcement officers are involved in spotting impaired and drug drivers. Welcome, Cara.
Hi. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. After Jake did his presentation and Glenn did his, you've seen kind of some of the challenges that Virginia potentially could face after legalization this month. And I want to talk about what Virginia's been doing over the last few years to try to prepare for this inevitability, as well as what we're doing here in the near future. So first of all, I want to look at some tox data. This is from the Department of Forensic Science, the Virginia Department of Forensic Science, of where we are right now, or over the past 8 to 10 years. So this is from 2012 to 2020. The most common drugs found, or the percentage of the most common drugs found in DUID cases. So as you can see on here on the far right, THC far outpaces any other drug. And that's not just in the last couple of years, that's been consistent over the last 8 years. So, I mean, realistically, we've had this problem as far as THC and cannabis impairment in our drivers, over the last several years. This isn't something that's been new for law enforcement, at least. So this is just another look at this over the past 5 years. Obviously, the most common drug has been THC, but you can also look down here at the 4 categories that we're seeing the most in tox screens. And this isn't just with, hold on. This isn't just, just cannabis isn't the problem. We have a DUID problem in Virginia in the totality of things. It's not just cannabis, but obviously cannabis is our most common drug that we find, and that's what we're really focusing on today. So some of the impaired driving programs that we've had in Virginia for a long time, obviously we do the standardized field sobriety testing that is funded by NHTSA. Most every law enforcement officer in Virginia has had that training, and if you go through the basic academy now, it's included in the basic academy training. We also have AROD, or the Advanced Roadside Impaired Driving Enforcement. That's also supported and funded by NHTSA. And then the DRE program kind of falls under the same umbrella. Again, these are all NHTSA programs. They're not anything new. They're all funded by NHTSA, and then they're managed and coordinated by the International Association of Chiefs of Police. So AROD is a 2-day course, and it's primarily for officers because it focuses on enforcement, as you can see in the name. But we also welcome and encourage prosecutors and toxicologists to come to the training to participate as candidates, as well as to help teach the class. We want to make sure that anything that we're teaching for law enforcement has the support of the prosecutor's office as well as DFS, and we welcome them to come in and teach those sessions in the course. And they do. We have had them several times. AROD is an introduction to DUID. It's an introduction to the 7 categories of drugs that we use in the DRE program. We talk about some of the, the things that you would normally see with the different categories, including cannabis being one of the categories, and how that relates to driving enforcement, or driving impairment and driving behaviors. And what, basically we just want to give officers enough information that they're making good, solid arrest or no arrest decisions on the side of the road in the middle of the night when there's just nobody else to call. And again, this course kind of bridges the gap between the basic class and the DRE class. We also talk about state and local challenges as far as, what are again, this is a national program, so we talk about, the laws as it pertains to Virginia and the DUI laws, and the procedures for the courtroom and the things that you have to follow to eventually get a successful prosecution. We also talk about articulating the impairment that you're seeing on the side of the road, articulating that both in courtroom testimony and in report writing, and some of the best practices for that. So AROD is a really good class. Again, it bridges the gap between that basic class, the basic NHTSA class, and the DRE program. And we're able to, by having AROD in Virginia, we're able to kind of build the DRE program because we get a lot of candidates in AROD to get them interested in, getting advanced DUID training. And then we have obviously the DRE program. Let me back up. I forgot with the AROD program. So we've had AROD in Virginia for a number of years now. I think, I can't remember when the first class that we had in Virginia, but I know we've consistently had them over the, since 2012 at least, and probably before that. AROD, we have, starting in September, we will have at least 2 classes a month, every month for at least for the next year or 2, and that's our goal. Most of those will be hosted at the Virginia State Police Training Academy, and VSP is planning on paying upfront for the lodging for that class and for lunch both days of class. So it's a very minimal financial burden for local departments to send officers to that course. Obviously, manpower would be the biggest one beyond the lodging and lunch. So the DRE program is the Drug Recognition Expert Program. You'll also hear it referred to as a Drug Evaluation and Classification Program. So I'm sure most of you, or many of you, are asking yourselves, what in the world is a DRE? Well, a DRE is an expert in drug impairment. I have impairment underlined there because the name Drug Recognition Expert, the keyword there being recognition, might be a little bit confusing for you if you're not familiar with the program, because it almost kind of implies identification. So for example, if you were to hand me a handful of pills and ask me as a DRE, hey, what is this? And I get asked that a lot by my officers on the side of the road or on calls. I'm not gonna be able to tell you with any scientific degree of certainty what those pills are. I'm a millennial, so I can operate Google and pillfinder.com and drugs.com just as well as anybody else, but I'm not going to be able to really tell you what those are. But what I do tell my guys is if you take those pills and we wait about 20 minutes, then I'll be able to tell you what you're under the influence of. We're experts in drug impairment, so I specialize, and all DREs specialize in what the observable signs and symptoms are consistent with drug use, including, again, cannabis. So the DRE comes in, you know, an arresting officer makes a stop, decides that the person is under the influence of some drug, and they make the arrest. Well, a DRE would be called to come in after the arrest and interview and evaluate the suspect for drug impairment. And that is basically, in a nutshell, what a DRE does. Now, DECP history, it started, you know, I don't want anybody to think that this is anything new. I mean, it's been around as long, and as you're about to see, it's been around longer than the NHTSA field sobriety, the standardized field sobriety test that we teach in the basic class. So everything started in LA in the 1970s. Officers were making, and if you know anything about the 1970s in LA, you know that there was, you know, they had a pretty big problem with PCP. And so they had officers who were making drug arrests, or excuse me, DUI arrests, but their arrestees had really low BACs, but a high level of impairment. So a traffic supervisor and a vice supervisor kind of recognized that this was a problem and wanted to develop a process to help, you know, more successfully prosecute these drivers and try to figure out exactly what was going on with them. So NHTSA got a hold of it, and those supervisors went around and they educated themselves. They went to ophthalmologists, they went to neurologists, they went to substance abuse counselors, they went to ER docs. Basically, you name it, they went and they educated themselves, and they came up with what we now know as the DRE program. NHTSA got a hold of it and said, hey, you know, there's this push, and we want to see if some of your tests that you've developed, do they work for alcohol impairment? And NHTSA funded a bunch of research into the program, and they were able to do those initial standardization and validation studies, and they found out that it does work for alcohol impairment. So they pumped the NHTSA basic class out to the rest of the country, and obviously we know how successful that has been for alcohol DUIs. Well, once that was over, NHTSA came back to LA and said, all right, let's see if this DRE thing actually works. So they went and they funded a bunch of lab and field studies to validate, to standardize the program, and to see if it actually worked. And what they found was that it does work. Those initial lab and field studies suggested that DREs were over 90% effective in identifying the correct category of drugs that the suspect was under the influence of, and they were over 90% effective in identifying those who were not impaired at all, so people who didn't have anything in their system. So they found that the DRE program was extremely successful. Now, that initial lab study did include cannabis in the initial lab study, and again, it was over 90% effective with officers or DREs calling the correct call, or calling the correct category of drug that was found in the system. Now, again, the cannabis that they used to dose subjects in that study was 3%. And you heard Jake talk about what you're seeing in just the plant material, that we're at 30% right now. So if DREs are effective in locating or in identifying subjects who are under the influence of cannabis at 3%, how effective do you think they are at 30%? And the answer is we're very effective. So here's the Virginia program. Actually, Virginia got the DRE program as one of the first few states to get the program back in the late 80s. For whatever reason, it just didn't catch on here in Virginia. And then in 2016, there was the Highway Safety Office and DMV. There was a big push to get the DRE program up and running and create a successful program that could last in Virginia. And as of right now, we have 21 DREs in Virginia. We had a DRE class in the middle of June, and those officers will complete certification training and be blessed as DREs next Friday. So hopefully we'll have 16 more by next Friday. We also have a DRE class scheduled for December the 6th to the 17th of December at Virginia State Police Academy. Again, that's actually being funded through VSP. We also have a class hopefully tentatively scheduled for May. The December class does have I lost my train of thought there. The December class the application process is still open. That's what I was going to say. The application process is still open if you have officers in your areas that you want to recommend or have apply for the program. So a little bit of training, what your officer is going to get into if they do decide to become a DRE. First of all, there's an application process. So before we even get into that, you have to be selected to attend. And what we're looking for in that selection process is just to make sure that the officers are dedicated to traffic and safety and DUI enforcement, because that's the primary goal of the program. Once you get the training, there's a preschool. That's a 2-day preschool, and then the 7-day DRE school. In Virginia, we've decided to do all of this together, so they're there for 2 full weeks for the training. There's a week of certification training where we actually go and we have the candidates evaluate people who are actually under the influence of different drugs, and the the candidate has to make the correct call for those subjects that they evaluate. So they have to actually use the training that they have, and we have to certify that they know the information, but also can apply it. And then there's a final knowledge exam that the candidates will complete after certification training. So there's 3 parts to the training. So then once they're trained, they're not done. They do have to recertify every 2 years. And then you have to have at least 8 hours of in-service training. So that's DRE level in-service training. You can't just go sit through the basic NHTSA class, or you can't just go, listen to a DUI speaker. It actually has to be DRE level training, 8 hours of in-service every 2 years. And in addition to that, you have to have at least 4 evaluations over the course of that 2 years. Now, my opinion on this is that 4 evaluations is simply not enough to maintain proficiency in the program. But the minimum standard is 4 evaluations. And of those 4, 2 of them in Virginia have to actually be enforcement evaluations. So you can't just go and scribe or go do a training evaluation on somebody at the police department. It actually has to be for a criminal case. Doesn't necessarily have to be for DUI, although we would like it to be, but it does have to be for a criminal case. And then 1 obstructor observed evaluation. So just some stats, just so you can kind of see where we are in Virginia. If you remember earlier in my presentation, I talked about what, with cannabis being the most common, or THC being the most common drug found in toxicology. It's also the most common drug that we see in our evaluations. So we make a call on cannabis more often than any of the other categories. Depressants follows as a close second. Narcotic analgesics and stimulants come after that. But cannabis is still, is the primary drug that we are, or category that we're calling, and THC is the primary drug that we're seeing. So this is just a look back of what I showed you earlier in the presentation. So the DRE program is primarily for traffic enforcement, for DUI enforcement. However, there are other uses for DREs, and so you can think about, how do I get my bang for my buck, not just through traffic safety. But you can use DREs in criminal investigations, any investigation that has to do with, drug impairment. You can use mental health calls. So obviously, mental health and substance abuse tend to go hand in hand. Either they're, you have people who have true mental health illnesses that started as mental health illnesses and now they're self-dosing with some form of drug, or they started off as a drug user and now they've used so much. Well, now they have some really concerning mental health issues. But that doesn't necessarily mean at the time of the call, the time that law enforcement is called, that they are actually under the influence. So a DRE can kind of go out and try to sway which direction an investigation needs to go from the start. Does it need to go the ECO route, or do we need to get them where they're getting mental health treatment, or is it something that we need to take criminal or some other route? The DRE can kind of guide that investigation. And then internal investigations with, when officers inevitably have crashes or anything like that, it's useful to have a DRE do an evaluation on the officer to make sure that the officer, wasn't impaired at the time of the crash, or if it's, you have an officer involved shooting, God forbid, You can have a DRE come in and just ensure that the officer wasn't under the influence, because some jurisdictions, some departments require a drug test after something like that. And obviously, just because it's present in the blood doesn't necessarily mean that the person was impaired. And we see that a lot even in our DUI cases. We have a medication come back in the blood doesn't necessarily mean that the person was impaired. That's what the DRE is for, is to make sure that the impairment was present. So any of these things, officers or DREs can be used, to help with normal functioning of a police department and investigations. So some of the ongoing expectations for DREs, the DRE program in Virginia is small and it's young. We do expect candidates, once they become DREs, to be good ambassadors of the program. We want them to go out there and partner with the community and educate the community, and talk, be able to, get into those driver improvement classes or those other things that we can, help educate the public on. It's not just about enforcement. We also want our DREs, once we spend this much money on a DRE to become certified, we want them to actually participate and do evaluations. And then, we currently only have 7 instructors. And as I mentioned, we're going to have 2 A-RIDE classes per month, and a DRE class, 2 DRE classes over the next year. And that is a lot of manpower that a department's losing with DRE instructors. So we need to also obviously increase our pool for instructors to be able to do the things that we want to do as a state, and keep our roadways safe. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. I'd like to hear any questions or comments that you all have.
Thank you so much, Cara. If I could ask Jake and Glenn to join us. We have a couple of questions in the chat. It looks like each of our questions may have been answered directly, but so everyone can benefit from them. The first, I'm going to address this, and then I'll invite the panelists. From Camille Newsom. Does the prohibition on selling apply to the seeds? If so, how would it be possible for people to legally grow the plants for their personal use? And Camille, that question is beyond the scope of this summit to offer any insights, advice, or guidance on how our General Assembly, in all its wisdom, made it legal to possess, potentially grow. I guess maybe there's some magic seeds out there. But that being aside, unless any of our panelists care to take that question on, I think it's outside the scope of this discussion today. And I'm sorry, Camille, but it does look like you got a direct answer from somebody. Anybody care to take that one on? No. All right. And then from George to everyone. If a state does not have reliable data regarding THC impairment prior to legalization, how can that state meaningfully talk about changes in THC impairment crash statistics after legalization? I know you've already replied directly to everybody for George, but if you could address that for us, please.
Sure. So in short, you can't do that, but being able to prove, to document the effects of legalization on the involvement of drivers who'd recently used cannabis in crashes or fatal crashes or whatever kind of crash you're interested in, it doesn't have to be the focus of the statistical analyses that you do in a state. So I think what's important is to, whenever you can get your data to the quality that it needs to be to conduct meaningful analysis, get it there. And then you want to look for changes over time from that point forward. Ideally, sure, it would be nice for the scientific community in general to understand the effect pre to post legalization in any state. But I wouldn't discourage efforts to improve data quality and availability within Virginia relative to cannabis use and driving, just because it wasn't taken care of before legalization in the state. Still make those efforts, still improve the data, and look for changes over time once you're able to do that. And we want to drive it down. So I would say that should be the focus.
I agree with Dick. You can't, unless you have a baseline, you don't know. Like when we had sales, people says it's going to go up. Like, well, how do you know it's going to go up? Because we don't know what it was. But for my state, it was really opportunity for us to start improving our data.
Thank you, gentlemen. Anybody out there have any other questions? That's all we've received in the chat so far, but we are right on time, actually 2 minutes over with finishing. Just a couple of final housekeeping announcements. There will be a survey sent out, and we're asking that everyone please take a few minutes to respond. Feedback's important. The summit will be held live next year, and your responses will be very helpful in helping determine how that summit will go. Next year's summit will be May 3rd through the 5th in Alexandria, Virginia. Again, we're back live and in person next year. As mentioned earlier, the presentations that our speakers gave will be sent out once the summit's complete. And the final session is tomorrow morning at 9:30, the evolution of the 4 E's, how we build the highway safety system of the future, informed by our experiences in 2020. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And thank you especially to our panelists for their presentation today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, Casey.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cara.